You've entered BOOKSTORM with Kristen Civiletto and me, Chris Storm. This is a podcast devoted to best-selling books that matter, books that make a difference. We're diving down deep with beloved authors about their stories. We're exposing hot-button topics and heartfelt themes, the issues that affect each of us in our own lives, as siblings, parents, partners, friends, as human beings. We're braving new ideas, fresh thoughts, hard lessons, and important truths. Those kinds of things that stay with us long after we turn the last page and close the book. Welcome back to BOOKSTORM Podcast, listeners in 82 countries, all 50 states. I think we're up to 1,800 cities, Kristen. Well, let me say to all of you, it's a very special episode for Kristen and I today because we have someone that we absolutely adore their writing. We are just so fans of them, even as a person. And we have Lisa Wingate, who was our very first guest on BOOKSTORM Podcast more than 2 years ago. We're thrilled that she's back with us here today. Lisa, we're so happy you've written another book. Of course, we adore it, and we can't wait to talk to you again.
I am so glad to be here. It's so good to see you two.
We're so happy to see you. You will never know how much you mean to us. Lisa took a chance on BOOKSTORM, being our very first author. And I promised I wasn't going to get choked up at this, and I'm not going to. I'm staying strong here. But we have a lot to thank you for, and we're just so grateful. So we're super excited to have you here today to talk about this new release called Shelterwood. And before we get started, I'm going to give our listeners a little more information about you as an author, because you have some accolades that have been so well earned and very well deserved. Now, Lisa is the author of, as you remember, the #1 New York Times bestseller, Before We Were Yours, that sat on the bestseller list for 2 solid years. Amazing. It has sold over 3 million copies. Her award-winning books have been published in over 40 languages now. They've appeared on bestseller lists everywhere. She's been nominated and garnered many awards, including Southern Book Prize, Oklahoma Book Award, Goodreads Choice, Publisher Weekly #3 longest running bestseller. She was voted by readers as a Good Reader's Choice Award for historical fiction. And Lisa, I have to bring this up that I saw on your website because it is really quite wonderful. The group called Americans for More Civility, which is a kindness watchdog organization, selected Lisa for their National Civics Award. And what this award does is it celebrates figures who work to promote greater kindness and civility in American life. What an honor that is. Now, here's a little fun note. She was inspired to become a writer by her first grade teacher, who said she expected to see Lisa's name in magazines one day. Have you connected with your teacher? Is she still here with us?
So that's a funny story. So when my first book came out, we were only in that school for a semester in the first grade, and then we moved. So I went back and contacted the school when my first book came out, and they weren't helpful. And then when my third book came out, it was actually dedicated to her because it had some teachers in the story and things. And the bookstore owner in Northborough, Massachusetts, where I had gone to Peasley School, got involved because Mrs. Crackhart, my first grade teacher, was a customer of hers. And she connected everybody. And so for years after that, Mrs. Crackhart and I kept in touch, and I would send her the books. And the last book I was able to send her was the one we did the interview about, The Book of Lost Friends. During the pandemic, when her nursing home was on lockdown, I was able to send her that book, and she sent me the sweetest picture of her out on the porch holding the Book of Lost Friends and Before and After, the sequel to Before We Were Yours, and just smiling. And she was almost 100 at the time, lifelong reader.
Wow. Well, thank you to your first grade teacher for putting that little nugget of hope in your heart to become a writer someday, because we are all benefiting from it. And we're thrilled to have you back with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I am so excited for all the podcast success. I remember when we did our very first interview together. It was at the holidays, so the mantle, fireplace mantle, was in the background with the Christmas decorations, and I just felt like I had been to your house to hang out and have book club or something. So it was great, and I just knew you guys would go on and do great things with it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's so sweet of you to say. Well, at least you might remember, we like to give our listeners a little bit of the background of what's going on in your story. And here we're talking about Shelterwood. This is the brand new one about to come out. Now, this novel is moving, emotional. It is an incredible story. So I want to give our listeners enough to tease them, but I won't give away any spoilers, I promise. This story, like some of your others, features a dual timeline, and we're taken to Oklahoma in 1909. We meet 11-year-old Olive Augusta Radley. She lives in a home with her mother, her stepfather, and also two Choctaw girls who are boarded in their home as what are called wards. Now, when the older girl disappears, Ollie, as she is known, flees to the woods and she takes the younger sister, Nessa, with her. They enter the Winding Stair Mountains. This is a very perilous place, not just because of the natural terrain, but also because we have outlaws and treasure hunters and very desperate men, especially at this time in history. Now, they form an alliance with other children like them, and together they face a number of perils and are seeking very hard to avoid more exploitation and even worse things that could happen. Now, the other timeline is set in Oklahoma in 1990, and we meet a law enforcement ranger. Her name is Valerie Boren Odell, and she and her son are relocating to take a job for her to be at the Horse Thief Trail National Park. It's away from her family, it's a quiet place, and she's trying to navigate being a single parent and also negotiate a career that's typically dominated by men. Now she reports for duty, and very quickly, we've got a local controversy that's brewing over the park's opening. We also have a teenage hiker who has gone missing on one of the trails. And we also have a long hidden burial site that is causing her a lot of questions. She's a little concerned about some of the things that she's hearing and seeing associated with that. So, as she is trying to uncover the truth, she starts to build an ally. She starts to run into a lot of opposition. But this rich story is so much about justice and conflict and exploitation and love, but also the beautiful, beautiful natural world. What a story! It is unforgettable. Would you like to add anything?
Oh, well, first of all, just thank you. Yeah, it's there's a lot to this story. A lot of kind of 90s history, or just National Park Service history and details, and then a very fascinating piece of history that is surprisingly buried, considering it's not that old. I'm always interested when I come across these pieces of history, and they're not even that old, but yet they've successfully been wiped from the public consciousness or drifted from the public consciousness. This piece of history is a little more of a case of selectively wiped from the public consciousness.
Absolutely. And again, we don't want to give away, anything too detailed because part of that history is how you unwind the story. So we'll be very respectful of that as we go through our discussions and let you take the lead on what you want to reveal.
Sure.
Oh, it's going to be
Absolutely.
tough, though. It's going to be tough because we love this book so much. I have to say to our readers, this is another treasure by Lisa Wingate. Got to get it. Lisa, you showed us the history of orphans, homeless, impoverished, starving, abused, and neglected children in this country. I loved the part in your book where the speech was given by the activist Kate Barnard while the little Ollie listened in. First, Kate spoke to our heart. She said 2 million American children are slaving in mines, mills, and factories while we gather here. But then Kate spoke to our mind, our reason. She said the true wealth of a nation must be figured in terms of child life. Yes, Kate, children are our future, then and now. And I had to ask you, Lisa, what drew you to this story? Can you expand upon the devastation of our country when our children are not cared for or educated? And I just have a feeling that this is a matter close to your heart.
Oh, absolutely. So I come from a family of educators, for one thing. If I weren't a writer, I would probably be a teacher. But some of the things in a story are things you come across as you're doing the research, as you start digging in. And Kate Barnard was kind of an early part of the story, because two things inspired this story, little history nuggets I came across actually while doing the last research checks for the Book of Lost Friends, the previous book. And I came across two things Oklahoma related, which fascinated me because I grew up in Oklahoma from early grade school through college. So two things I came across the story of little Sarah Rector, a little girl, 11-year-old girl growing up in a cabin out in the woods in Oklahoma with her family around the turn of the century, and receiving marriage proposals from grown men all over the world. And I came across an old newspaper clipping about a woman who discovered elf children living in a hollow tree. She had gotten reports of these elf children, and she went to see what, these children were living in this hollow tree. What those two things have in common was the discovery of oil on land that had passed into these children's hands when the lands of the 5 tribes of Oklahoma, of eastern Oklahoma, so that's the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole tribes, are forcibly divided up, and parcels of land are put into the ownership of each man, woman, and child who's a member of the various tribes on the rolls. So this is done by the government under the Dawes Commission right around the turn of the century. And so children become landowners. Then the laws are relaxed on kind of the ownership and sale of land, that's gradually relaxed so people can get some control over this land. And very quickly, obtaining guardianships over Native children becomes like the lightning lane to riches. And grafters flood into Oklahoma by the hundreds and thousands. Grafters, lawyers, pretty soon everybody's involved in it. The grafters themselves who go to the probate courts and seek guardianships over these children, the probate judges in all these counties who are overseeing these cases, the law enforcement in these counties, the merchants in these counties who are selling things to these to these kids' estates through the guardians for exorbitant prices. There are all kinds of schemes. People are making all this money. And meanwhile, the children who become wards of these profit-seeking guardians, there's really little to no oversight. There's no incentive to make sure these kids are fed, protected, taken care of, not exploited, not abused sexually or otherwise. I mean, no one is overseeing the care of the children. So when Kate Barnard in 1909 hears this report of the elf children, and she goes to see what it is, she at the time has been newly elected at the first statehood legislature of Oklahoma in 1907, the end of 1907. She's been elected by the widest margin of any candidate on the ballot in an age when women can't even vote. She has the biggest, largest influence on the writing of the Oklahoma State Constitution. I mean, she is the most popular politician, the most powerful politician in the state at the time. when she discovers these children and finds out who they are and that they have a guardian who's living on their oil monies while the children are trying to survive in the woods, she fires the first shots across the bow in a war that becomes epic to try to end this system of organized crime, basically, that's going on but it organized, legalized crime, basically, that's going on in Oklahoma and has been going on for a little while. And the thing is, if she had won that battle in 1909, most of us have heard of Killers of the Flower Moon and the murders among the Osage tribe, which the Osage Nation is a little farther west in Oklahoma, west and northish, but west, central north Oklahoma, basically. And the Osage Nation it's a little different case because of the way the lands were owned and the way the oil rights were owned. So it's a little different thing than this. But if Kate Barnard had won her battle in 1909, the Osage murders would have never happened. And she doesn't get any credit. She just disappeared from history, and the history came back as the men of the FBI, and Congress sent the men of the FBI to take care of this problem. And the fact is, the women were in this fight a decade and a half earlier.
Wow, that is fascinating. We're going to talk a little bit more about the women and the indigenous people, but I want to throw a little something else in here. You did something very wise, and you've done it in your prior books also, by telling a story through the eyes of a child. So we have all heard about the atrocities done to the indigenous people in this country. It takes on a whole other meaning when you look at the life of a helpless young child and you see the things done to them in a specific way. We saw that with your other books. You showed us through the eyes of a child. Thank you for doing that. It's a different bend on history because children are so honest and so innocent.
Absolutely. Well, kids don't have, the thing is, none of us see the world as it is. We see the world as it looks through all the filters we have on our own lens. So that's all that, how you were raised, where you were raised, what kind of parents you had, what kind of childhood you had, where you went to school, everything. So we all see the world filtered, and the older we get, the more stuff is on the glass, the more life experiences we're looking through. And kids have far fewer life experiences to look through. So, it's a much more naive, unfiltered look at the world, trying to understand why things are this way and trying to understand why people do the things they do. And I think that affects you in a different way as a listener to a story, to hear how a child sees it and what a child understands of it. And I think that's good for us, to get away from our filters and see how does this affect a child? And in this case, the fact is the victims of this were children, and children happened to be also Kate Barnard's deepest passion. So it's sort of a melding of someone's deepest passion to protect children and the situation these children are in. And I couldn't really have seen a more effective way to tell this story than through the children.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So I want to ask you a little bit about your beautiful title. You use the role of Shelterwood trees to illustrate so many beautiful sentiments in this story. And I want to touch on a few things. This is a quote from your book. Shelterwood trees, and there's the quote, keep the forest safe from the wind and the weather, from too much sun and heat in the summer, too much snow in the winter. They're strong and pull out the water from down deep in the drought times. Hold the soil so everything smaller can grow. And all of that comes from the roots of this big old tree. The old take care of the young, just like a family. Now, it's a beautiful picture of the nurturing that we all need, especially many characters in your story. And I was wondering if you can expand upon that metaphor of the nurturing aspect a bit.
Absolutely. So sometimes the title for a book comes partway through the book. That was not the original title of this book, but while I was becoming an honorary National Park Service ranger through all the research, I came across the term Shelterwood, and was not a word I'd heard. And when I read about it and what it was, I thought that's exactly that's the story in a nutshell. These kids who go to try to survive in the woods on their own because they don't have the human shelter they need. So they go to the forest to try to create a place of shelter for themselves. That's Ollie's big dream, is try to formulate a place in the woods where they will all be safe, where all these kids that they have encountered along the way and bonded together with will be safe. And the Shelterwood is such a metaphor for that, because if you've ever seen, my husband is from southeastern Oklahoma, where this story is set down in the Winding Stair Mountains and the Kiamishi Mountains. And so it's an area of the country I was familiar with growing up, but became more familiar with when I married into that part of the country, or that part of the state. And what we were seeing when we first married in the late 80s, early 90s and stuff, we would go down the highway and you would just see giant patches of these beautiful forested mountains laid bare, basically cut bare, plowed over, just dirt blowing. And a lot of these would be reforested, but the forests are not the same when you cut the Shelterwood. Clear cutting is very hard for the land to recover from. More responsible timbering is done by leaving some of the Shelterwood, cutting uneven aged trees, so smaller and bigger, and leaving the Shelterwood to protect the saplings as they grow up. And that to me was such a perfect metaphor for the kids in the story, because children need that Shelterwood, and sometimes it's their families, and sometimes it needs to be their communities, teachers, volunteers, people who are active, volunteering in their local schools or at their local libraries or in their youth programs. Sometimes other people need to be the Shelterwood, but for young kids not to be blown over by the wind and the weather and the storms and the floods that wash away the soil, they're like the little saplings in the forest. They need these trees that pull the water up out of the ground, and that hold off the wind and the rain and the snow. And so as soon as I read about it, that is such a picture for the children in this story, but children in general.
Yeah, absolutely. You explained that so beautifully. I also loved the fact that these children had the sense that they could get that from where they were heading into the woods. In fact, several people in your story, you could see that connection with the natural world was very important to them, not just physically as protection, but even spiritually and emotionally.
Absolutely. Kids, I mean, that's so natural for kids. I can remember, and I think probably every kid can remember, um, crawling under the front porch or something and making a club, and you were going to have, a club with your friends under the front porch or under your blanket fort in the living room, or wherever your spot was, right? That's childhood. You're always kind of seeking to make your own little world that is unbothered by the rules of adults, and it's always going to be this perfect world with your friends, and where you can live out all your dreams. And so Ollie is kind of at that. She's 11, so she's kind of at that, just that jumping off point when you're still young enough to kind of believe in your imaginary worlds and have all that going on in your head still, but she's at that tipping point toward adulthood. And with girls, I mean, we all know, having been girls, with girls, that is such a big and rapid change often, that the closing of the door on those childhood things, and jumping into adulthood and trying to learn to walk like the pretty girls walk and all that stuff, and Ollie is just still at that point where she's still giving things in the forest a fanciful name, and still believing that she can form her own little kingdom for herself and her friends.
Yeah, beautiful, beautifully put.
I'm going to switch it up a little, because I was going to talk more about the Indigenous children, but I think you covered it already. There's a quote that I wrote down because I really loved it. It was a thought that Valerie had when speaking of death. I just want to remind our readers that one of the first scenes opens to some bones having been found in a cave. And then let's backtrack. Now, we all deal with death every day in our lives, but Valerie said something that hit the reader's heart. She said, "You can't let yourself picture your family receiving the news. You must not contemplate the fragile veil between life and death, clear like glass, so that you can be face to face with it and never know." Wow. Now we know Valerie didn't really say that, that Lisa wrote that beautiful quote. Can you expand on that a little bit? What that is? We all can imagine the horror of having to report this, but then the quest remained of having to know the truth. She was on a mission to know the truth.
Of course. So one of the things I learned about national park law enforcement personnel is they are more likely to die in the line of duty than any other branch of law enforcement.
Wow.
I know, right? You think of national parks or the parks as kind of a picnic, or I mean, everybody thinks they want to be a park ranger. It looks so great. Walk around in the woods and talk to tourists and hand out water bottles or whatever, you know. But it's actually very dangerous, especially in law enforcement, because they tend to be off by themselves when taking on a situation. And there's a quote: "Impavement brings all of society's problems into the wilderness." So they deal with people hiding out, criminals looking for a place to hide, abusive families looking for a place where they can do their thing without being bothered, overconsumption of alcohol, drugs, people looking for places to grow drugs. I mean, all of that they deal with, and they're very often off by themselves, out of radio contact, dealing with these things. So Valerie's not unaware of the danger of her job, but she's very dedicated to her job as well. And so I think, having interviewed law enforcement personnel and Ranger Jody, who was my big source and read the book and helped me a lot to get all the details right. You know, you see some pretty awful things and deal with some pretty awful things, and you do see death, and you have to learn how find your way of dealing with it. And that's kind of what Valerie is expressing there. You have to realize how fragile life is and how quickly circumstances can go wrong when you are faced in your job regularly with situations where that has happened.
Yeah, I just love that quote. It just hit all of us in such a strong way in our own real life. And I love the character Valerie too. Really loved her. Thank you.
Lisa, I want to ask you about yet another aspect of your story we haven't touched on. Your story is so rich. Women's groups played a pivotal role in the beginning of the 20th century in calling out injustice. And they highlighted the rampant abuse of vulnerable people, as we've been talking about, exploitation, misogyny. And part of your story takes place 70 to 80 years after those groups began to fight for the right of women to vote, for example. But all those years later, we see where Valerie is still having to deal with very significant misogyny. Her law enforcement role is minimized. You know, she's derisively referred to as a lady ranger or a rangerette. And I wanted to ask you, was Valerie's role in 1990 only possible because of the sheltering, as we talk about Shelterwoods, of these towering heroines like Kate Barnard?
I think so. Even though, you know, Kate's history was buried, one of the things that happened was she had solicited the women's clubs. She was a little dubious about the women's clubs because she felt like they didn't go any farther than hand wringing about situations. But Kate is eventually kind of overtaken by the power of the oil men and the land barons and the money against her. And so she does win back a fair amount of property for indigenous landowners, but she is eventually more or less defeated by the tides against her. But she planted the seed in the women's clubs, which at the turn of the century, when Kate Barnard's around, the women's clubs are maybe a little too new to have fully taken that on. It was still very scandalous. The idea that a woman would leave her house in the middle of the day without the children and without a male relative to chaperone her through town and go somewhere to sit and talk with other women about politics and books and other things of concern. Oh my goodness. It was quite the scandal. So in a lot of places, the women who started these clubs or participated in them, were kind of looked at down the nose by some of the women out sweeping their porches or whatever in the middle of the day. And so, and it's interesting to imagine that, because things that seem so normal to us now once were not. And so that ground was broken by Kate Barnard, and then it ends up being plowed about 15 years later by the women's clubs, who put together a commission to go around Oklahoma and study the matter of the land grab from these indigenous landowners. And one of the people who serves on that commission and writes a fair bit of the eventual report is a woman named Gertrude Bonin, who is from the Sioux Nation and is an indigenous rights activist at the time and a popular speaker at the women's clubs. And so she is able to go around Oklahoma and specifically talk to victims, to children who have been exploited by the land grabbers and the guardians. She is largely responsible for producing this report with two male co-workers she went around the state with. And this report is given back to the women's clubs, and they do the most brilliant thing with it. And a little bit of congressional testimony is at the top of in one of the chapter head quotes late in the book. They do the most ingenious things with it, because instead of giving their report to Congress or going to Congress with it, they released it to the newspapers all over the country. So by the time Congress hears about it and is mightily offended, it's already been released. It's already out there, and the public is making an outcry about it. And I would contend that is part of the reason why the Osage murders do end up being addressed, because the women's clubs and their report to all the newspapers has already raised a big stink, and Congress already has a woman problem. And, and then the Osage murders are gaining some publicity. And so they have to start addressing with some changes in law, with the investigation of the Osage murders. They have to start addressing this thing that everyone has been turning a blind eye to, because they're all making money from it.
Yes. Yes. I mean, it just goes right back to power and money. And what does it take to stand up to power and money? And so I love that you used that example. And I think this book really spoke to me too. And Chris may feel this way, because I was one of those people who entered the professional world in the early 1990s. And so I was identifying with Valerie, because guess what? People in my law firm the women didn't wear pantsuits. Working when you had children was actually still kind of a big to-do. And so I was really thinking about how we haven't come that far in some respects, and in some respects we have, but there's not a lot of time that has elapsed between these historical incidences. So really,
Yeah,
really
no,
well done.
Absolutely. I had a friend who went into the Park Service out of college. She was a criminal justice major and wanted to go into park law enforcement, and ran into a lot of the things back in those days, we used to write letters. So she and I would write letters back and forth, and she ran into a lot of hazing and a lot of the things that Valerie runs into. And it, all those decades later, I mean, some things change and some things stay the same. And so it's an accurate reflection of some, probably not everyone's experience, but there were also some congressional hearings on that matter, treatment of women in the National Park Service. So, I learned a lot, and how tough some women had to be and have to be to pioneer their fields.
Yeah. Excellent.
Loved it.
Well, Before we let you go, we're wondering if you can give our listeners just a little glimpse about what you might be working on next, maybe what's on your radar.
Oh, so it would be on the radar because right now I'm just working on getting Shelterwood out into the world, which every book turns into a little bit of a full-time job for a while when it's releasing. But I do have another story on my radar that's kind of a mid-century story. Has a little bit to do with horses. I was a horse girl, so every once in a while, I always have a tender spot in my heart for anything equine. And other than that, I probably won't say too much because I don't know yet exactly which way the story is going, but I can feel it's a piece of history I've known about for a long time. And it's funny how, I'll have some neat things and don't exactly know what I do with it in a story. And then all of a sudden one will start to germinate. And so this one is starting to germinate and will turn into a story.
Oh, that's wonderful. We're so excited to hear that. We want to keep reading what you write, and I would love to see another story involving Valerie too. I'm just going to put that out there just for your consideration. Now, I know our listeners are going to want to connect with you, and they can find you at your beautiful website, lisawingate.com. You also are on Facebook, on Instagram, on Pinterest, Goodreads, on BookBub. But we just know that people are going to love this story, and we are so grateful that you came onto the show to talk about it. This was a fascinating discussion. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for having me. I would hang out with you girls anytime.
Oh, good, because you're coming back when this next
Yeah.
book comes out right away. We just are huge fans. Thank you so much, Lisa.
Absolutely.
Take care now.
Bye.
Well, wasn't that a treasure having Lisa Wingate back with us again? And I mean, it just feels like family because she got us started on here, jump started. And like all of her books, this book has so much meaning, and we're learning about a piece of history that we may never have known about. And I'll tell you what, I just loved every second of it. And the plight of the children in this story and the abuse and neglect of the children in this story, it just really hit my heart hard. I just loved it. How did you feel, Kristen?
Oh my gosh, completely enthralled because first of all, as she does with everything, she's always operating on multiple levels. There's that whole metaphoric level, but there's also the reality of what she is shining a light on. And so I think that's one of the reasons why she's one of the best writers, hands down, in America today. There is no question about that because it's effortless. And when you're reading this story, you're still entertained. You are in the moment, but also there's so much to think about. Do you
In,
feel that way when
in
you're
two
reading her
time
story?
periods, so we can relate
Yeah.
to it today, but
Yeah.
yesterday, effortless to the reader. But yet, when you read this, you can see she put so much research and
Yeah.
huge amount of work into this story. Um, I want to say one other thing. We didn't talk much about a lot of the men in this book. They weren't all bad. And Valerie's father said to her at one point, now here's a common saying that I'm telling you, it hit the reader hard. The right thing is never the easy thing. Oh my goodness. I wanted to say, Lisa, even to this day, the right thing is never the easy thing. Sometimes you hear the path less traveled, the person who stands up for the marginalized voice or the underrepresented, the person who dares to be unpopular and voice a cause. Boy, that hit home for me. How about you, Kristen? I'm sure
Yeah.
you too.
Oh my gosh, I totally identify with that. And, especially because people will go to extreme lengths to protect their power and their position and their money. And, what are the lengths they're going to go through? They're going to shut you down. They're going to marginalize you. They're going to call you names and discredit you. Whatever it is that they can do, they're going to do it. And that's why it's so hard to stand up to people who are abusing power or who are unethical. So
Yeah.
I absolutely agree. And I love that here, we're going back to oil, something that has caused contention for 150 plus years in the world. I mean, wars have been fought over it, but you can see where there's immense amounts of money and power at issue.
And I think that this is very timely, this book, because it came out at is the exact same time that we are talking a lot about plights of Indigenous people in this country and women. And she's looped both of this in together. just like the World War II stories, these stories right here in our country, there are so many that have never been told, untold stories about things that have happened, uh, injustices that have occurred. And I'm so grateful to Lisa for happening upon this and not turning a blind eye, but taking a good hard look at it and bringing it to light for the rest of us. Just love this story.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I want to tell our listeners about some of the other amazing authors that we have coming up. I'm going to give you just a handful, but there's a whole bunch. We have Amiko Jean, The Return of Ellie Black, Jamie Brenner, A Novel Summer, Kate White, The Last Time She Saw Him, Lisa Barr, The Goddess of Warsaw, Jill Shelvis, The Summer Escape, and we have Brian Andrews and Jeffrey Wilson who are writing for Tom Clancy. It's a book called Act of Defiance, and we cannot wait to talk about all of those books. We are growing every week. So, listeners, thank you again for tuning in. We ask that you continue to share our socials. We want to have these in depth discussions with authors. We think that they love it, but we know that you do too. And Chris and I are having a ball talking to them about these deep subjects and the things that really motivated them as they were writing the story. You can stay on the radar with us, bookstormpodcast.com. We're also on Facebook, on Instagram, on X, and you find us on TikTok and YouTube, where we have a whole bunch of videos that you can see us and these authors. So until next time, listeners, one of the best ways to brave the storm is to dive down deep into life-changing fiction.